Major support for these programs is provided by Bank of America Merrill Lynch and Perfect Building Maintenance, New York Community Bank, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, M&T Bank, Chase Commercial Term Lending. Additional support is provided by AVR Realty Company, LLC, Bingham McCutcheon, LLP, Briarwood Organization, Bruce Mosler, Capital One Bank, Cassidy Turley, C.B. Richard Ellis, Chelsea Lighting, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, DDG Partners, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Friedman LLP, Accountants and Advisors, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Genova Burns and Gian Tomasi, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Corman Communities, Madison Realty Capital, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Certified Public Accountants and Business Advisors, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Site Comply, Sterling and Sterling, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, the Wickoff Group, Urban American, and Ackman Ziff Real Estate, Ariel Property Advisors, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Goldman Properties, Moynihan Group, Muss Development, RAL Development Services, the Spandrel Group, LLC, Rosewood Realty Group, Triangle Equities.
You know, there was once a time when women would wear furs. Furs were big items. Today, very few people even know what furs are. But there was a man who really recreated the fur business. He was known as Fred the Furrier. And today I have Fred the Furrier, who over the last 22 years of his life hasn't been Fred the Furrier, but who's been involved with the Auschwitz Center and Genocide, the legendary Fred Schwartz. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Michael. Nice to be here.
So, Fred, let's go back to the grandparents. Your father was born here?
My father and my mother were both born in what is now Ukraine.
Right. So tell me, you tell me your father. How did he come over here?
He came over here alone, as did his all his other siblings.
And it was a small family, only 11, right?
11 boys.
11 boys, and they lived on Tremont Avenue?
Near the neighborhood of Tremont Avenue, Tremont section.
In the Tremont section. And how'd they get into the fur business or the pelt business?
Well, I asked years later, I asked some of my uncles after my father passed away, I said, you know, what are the origins of the family? How far back do we go in the fur business? And he said, we were always in that business. We used to take the
Even in New Ukraine?
Yeah, we took the animal skins, we dried them and tanned them, and we made warm jackets out of the animal furs.
So let's talk about you. You were born in the Bronx yourself.
Yes.
And you and your brother Harold?
Correct.
Any other siblings?
No, just the two of us.
Just you and Harold.
When you're born in the Depression, you can't have a lot of kids.
I agree. So you're born in the Depression, and where do you go to public school?
PS 70, which is now on the Cross Bronx Expressway.
Now the interesting thing is, since you were truly an entrepreneur growing up, you were telling me, because we got together like right after the Thanksgiving Day parade, one of your initial entrepreneurial business was buying balloons for 3 cents, and from the age of 13 to 18, you had this part-time every year at the Macy's Day Parade. What did you do?
We got down very early in the morning. We went down by the Museum of Natural History on the west side, and we would start to blow up as many balloons as we could possibly hold and wait for the parade to get started. And then we would try to sell the balloons while the people were waiting. But as soon as the parade started, all the kids were looking up and nobody was going to buy balloons. So we would rush, take all our balloons, get into the subway and ride down to the old Metropolitan Opera House, around 39th Street, and then we would position ourselves to be there before the parade got there, and we'd be able to sell the balloons there.
Now, this was a very profitable business, you told me.
Well, yeah, we made.
You bought the balloons for about 3 cents?
Sold them for 25 cents. But I had one really good lesson that I learned from that experience. A man came over with his little boy, and he gave me a quarter to give him a balloon, and I pulled the balloon out of the stack, and it blew out of my hand and blew across the street. So I reached in to give him another balloon. He said, "I'd like my quarter back." I said, "Why?" He says, "If it's not worth it to you to walk across the street for the quarter, for the balloon, it's not worth it to me to buy one from you for a quarter."
Very, very good lesson. So besides the balloon business, what were you doing when you were growing up?
Well, commercially, I delivered orders. Basically played a lot of marbles. Anyway, it used to be called Emmys in New York. And
Now, you graduated which high school?
Taft High School.
Taft High School. Graduated Taft in what year?
1949.
And then you go to City College.
City College. Yeah,
Now, there was City College, Lower Manhattan, but you went to City College, the Bronx.
Correct. Well, upper Manhattan.
Upper Manhattan,
Yeah.
Upper Manhattan, over there, City College. And what were you doing at City College? What were you learning? What was you?
Well, I was undecided. Really didn't have a clear picture. My parents hadn't really been educated. My father was probably never in a school in his life, so it was very difficult for me to really get a focus, and they couldn't guide me very much. So I just kind of took general courses at City College.
You met your wife at a very young age, right?
Yeah, she was 5, I was 6.
So you've known each other a couple years, and so. You go to City College, you get married right after City College, am I correct?
Correct.
And Fred Schwartz decides that he's going to become in the Foreign Service? You took the exam to be in the Foreign Service?
Correct.
What was this? I mean, this wasn't something that from furries, pelts, and skins?
I had a broad view of the world, and I was very interested in what was going on, particularly because I was a child raised during the period of the Second World War, so I became very internationally conscious, and I used to really follow all the politics and the war itself, and so I became very concerned about how the world was shaped up.
So you take the test, and you score 69.
Correct.
And you needed a 70.
Correct.
To get into it. So now what happens is you decide that, City College graduate, bright, energetic guy, former merchandising man in the balloon business, that you should get an executive training program, right?
Correct.
And how many executive training programs did you apply for?
Well, it was a new idea then, companies preparing for their own future by grooming young executives. So I applied for over 60 different companies, mostly out of the Manhattan phone book when I recognized the names. And I had a few interviews out of that, but universally rejected by everybody.
So now you're married, and you're unemployed, and your brother Harold is working in the fur business.
Correct.
Doing what?
It was a buying office for out-of-town stores, finding merchandise for them.
So Harold says to you, "Hey, you got to make a living. It's better to do something by coming to my office."
He said, "Nobody else will hire you anyway."
That's exactly how one of the articles came in. So when do you join Harold?
1954, 55.
You're how old at this time?
21, 22 years old.
So you go in there, and you and Harold are sharing this 5x7 office.
Right.
What, on 7th Avenue?
Yes, on 7th Avenue.
And like in the fur district at that time, 27th Street?
The heart of the fur market.
The heart of the fur markets where the pelts are being schlepped and all the rest. And how do you differentiate yourself from the other furriers?
Well, it was a struggle for a few years because I couldn't. I was the only college graduate in the entire industry because it was very unattractive. Men never sent their children to be working in the fur business. So a young person like myself became very obvious, but I also was very ineffective. I really couldn't break through until I finally realized that it had to be marketed in a different way.
Now, was the first marketing the orchid?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about the orchid. I mean, people wouldn't even know what an orchid is, but okay, tell me about this.
Well, there was a breakthrough at the time, and the orchids were growing in Hawaii in tremendous amounts, but they were very delicate, and they couldn't get shipped into as far east as New York. But then the jet plane came along, and you could ship them overnight. And they moved coincidentally right into the fur market in 27th Street. So I went over to them and I suggested that we would be able to buy their orchids from them if they could arrange to mail them with a gift card that we would give them to be mailed out. Then I put that together with a small fur scarf that we used to be selling.
So you'd have a fur scarf, and you get an orchid. And how was the promotion?
It was packed into a simulated flower box. A plastic box. It was very pretty, very color and purple, looked like the color of the orchids. And we called it Orchids and Mink. And we knew that most of these scarves were sold for either Easter or for Christmas.
And there was a card.
And there was a gift card. And he would mail it into Orchids of Hawaii. Orchids of Hawaii would mail the orchid out to arrive at the time that the card requested. And then the man usually would give the woman a gift of the the mink scarf. I realized the same day her orchid would arrive in the mail with a personal message.
How do you market this? Who bought this? Was it sold to the...
It was explosive. It was explosive. We sold everybody from the top stores down to Sears Roebuck's catalog. They all wanted it.
So who was the salesman? Harold was... What was Harold? Harold was in the back.
Yeah. Well, and we were selling other major, stoles and jackets and things like that, which were less...
And at that time, the company was called Mademoiselle Furs?
Correct.
So the orchids come first.
Yeah.
And then there was somebody by the name of Pat Boone. Pat Boone had what? Other scarves or something?
Yeah, he was at the time, he was at the pinnacle of his career. And he was on the cover of Life magazine, very, very well known and very attractive. And we got Pat Boone to endorse our raccoon collars. And they were detachable, so they could be put on.
Was this like Davy Crockett's raccoon collars?
Well, the same kind of fur, but it looked a lot nicer than the Davy Crockett hat.
So these were raccoon collars that Pat Boone would endorse.
They were called Pat Boone raccoon collars, and
these were sold
at stores, specialty stores all over.
But now the interesting thing is, you were selling them. They were available in specialty stores, JCPenney. But okay, it's not the raccoon. It's the next item that you created. Fur muffs?
Hair muffs, made out of rabbit hair.
Rabbit ear muffs? Yeah. I wish I had them, okay.
Yeah, and we would we'd sell those mostly through the big chain outfits, and it was an enormous number because it was a way to get a little bit of fur for very little money.
Now, in addition, so you're in the fur business, you were in the promotional business. You were tying companies, GM and Coke. What were you doing with that?
Well, we started out using furs, but then the ideas were more important than the product. So we were able to organize for many companies, DuPont, General Motors, and Coca-Cola and others, helping them with their marketing needs. So we would be able to design motivational programs for their dealers, for their distributors, for their jobbers, for their ultimate consumers, to be able to move more product through these means. And it's a very attractive business. It really does move tons of product for these companies.
So now it's 1965. You're about what, 30, 34, 35?
Yeah, right.
1965, and for today Union Square is hot as hell. Everybody wants to be in Union Square. You got Nordstrom's Rack, you have Whole Foods, you used to have Filene's Basement until recently, you have DSW, you have all of this, Virgin was there, everything is in Union Square. There was something called S-Klein on the square. What happens?
S-Klein was unique. They were the bargain store of America. It was a disarray. The merchandise was all over the place, but people knew that the values were tremendous, and they flocked to the store. And their reputation in furs was very high.
So how did you get to get into S-Klein?
Well, they had a new management come in. Shalom Rickless bought the company, and they were very unhappy with their fur operator. And we weren't retailers, but they approached us to be able to think about taking over their retail operation. It was a pretty mature, sophisticated retail department, which we had to learn, which wasn't our natural business. But we did. We took over all 13 of their stores.
And then, in every manner that Michelou or Rickless did, he closed the operation.
Correct.
So the stores closed. But then there was another guy, originally from the Bronx, the Farkas family, who opened up on Fordham Road, and you get into the legendary Alexander's department stores.
Yeah, especially the store on 59th Street.
Okay, you get into 3 stores at that time? Yeah. Mm-hmm. You get into Regal Paramus?
No, for Roosevelt Field.
Roosevelt Field and 59th Street. And at that time, it's your buddy Marty Shaw who's doing radio advertising for you. Tell me about Marty and you in radio advertising before we get to Fred the Furrier.
Well, we realized that being in the newspaper was only it was a bargain sheet at those times, because everything was always price, and it was very hard to sell a prestige product on price alone. So we started to look for other means of advertising, and I went to Marty at the time and discussed the idea of finding another means. We thought the radio would be logical. We never thought television was within our price range, but we did think that the radio might work.
So this is 1974.
Correct.
And in 1974, you're running basically a fashion show or something. You're showing some of your products, and you meet someone at NBC, and and the guy says, you can use my studio, but you can't use my lights because it's going to cost you money for the labor. And the people in the audience were there with flashlights.
Correct.
So now what happens? And after that fashion show, that guy who you met then says to you, Fred, you owe me, you have to advertise. What happens? You go see the station manager.
Yeah, well, he called me and said, you know, a verbal agreement in the television industry is a binding agreement. And I realized that this is not going to be a good discussion. So I said, you know, rather than us discuss this, let me meet with your boss, because I was sure he's going to be more reasonable and understanding. And we did, and we met with the man by the name at that time, Dom Camera, who was a station sales manager for NBC.
And tell me about that, because that's Don Cameron and Marty Shaw and you got the next movement. Okay, so you meet with Dom, and he offers you something like a deal of a lifetime, right? It
was amazing. Because it was January and February showing. Those days, no retailer was on television. And they were trying to break through into the television medium, besides which time when it goes by on a television station is lost forever. So he decided that he would try to offer us time in January and February at an extremely attractive rate, in the hope that...
And he gave you a great time. He gave you the 7 o'clock in the morning.
The Today Show, the 6 o'clock news, and the 11 o'clock news. 3 prime spots for us who were trying to sell working women.
And he's saying to you, I'm going to give you this deal. I'm going to give you like 60 slots.
2 weeks worth
of ads.
And if it
5
doesn't
days
work,
a week. And if it doesn't work,
well, I'll do it again.
So you get 4 weeks. So Fred goes out and goes to the 2 other networks.
Yeah.
So you go to
CBS
and ABC, and you said, I got this deal over here. You're going to meet the deal, right?
Correct.
So what happens next? You have the time. You know, you've done print ads, you've done other things. You've never done TV. No. So tell me what happens. I mean, because this is the start of a legendary 12-year period of time that, you know, anyone who are in their late 50s, early 60s remembers Fred the Furrier.
Well, you know, we looked at this and we said, you know, we don't have a budget to do the production. Production's a very expensive thing. So we tried to get Bess Myerson, who had just retired as New York City's consumer affairs person. And she rejected flatly for the amount of money. Not that she wouldn't have taken more money, but...
You didn't have the budget.
We just couldn't pay her. So finally one day Martin calls me up and said, you know, we looked all over. We can't find a spokesperson to do this. I said, but you're a furrier. You're an authentic furrier. Even though you're not a professional, you will come across as somebody who knows his business and is, you know, really steeped in that industry. So reluctantly, we agreed, because we already committed for the time on all 3 networks.
Right, and the initial, I read in one of the magazines, it said the initial commercials were like home movies. I mean, they really weren't there. But you subsequently, you know, how'd the ads do? It did fantastic.
It was amazing. It was amazing. We were flooded with customers. And the calling of the names, which was
right. So let's talk about that. That was an idea, okay? Hey, I'm Fred the Furrier. Hey, Marilyn. Hey, Marlene. Hey, Sarah. What was the
personalizing of it made it very real. It made I was perceived as an authentic furrier, which I was, but also it was also communicating with the customer. You telling the customer that I really, you know, I sort of know who you are symbolically. And, you know, you could find us to be accessible, available. Why don't you really try us out and take a look at it?
It was also selling furs to the working woman. The Citibank story. Tell me that story.
Well, what we were able to do was to really capitalize on the idea that the women's movement had started, and women were really breaking through the glass ceiling in lots of ways. But it was very hard to distinguish for a woman between a secretary or a telephone operator and as an executive in the firm. Because women dress well, they're well coiffed, they use the right makeup, so it's...
Speaking of that, you had a coif also at that time.
Yeah, right. It was very difficult to sell that. The one story that was so typical was this woman, I happened to be in a store when she was trying on coats, and you could see she was very unsettled about what her choices. And finally she just blurts out, she says, look, she says, I'm a vice president at Citicorp. I need a coat to walk through the lobby. Meaning that she wanted to be distinguished as an executive rather than as somebody at a different level.
Marty coined you Fred the Furrier,
Right.
America's Furrier. Yeah. Who coined the fur vault?
I did when we were negotiating with Alexander's, because Alexander's was considered to be a moderate to medium price store, but we wanted furs to be more distinguished within the store. So we spoke to the Farkases at the time we were negotiating with them. We said we'd like to have a separate name for the department within the Alexander's the store. And I suggested that we call it the Fur Vault, meaning it was something precious, and it was obviously identified furs. And they agreed that that was the right marketing idea.
And then over the next, the Fur Vault went public. It was a publicly held company. You had opened up stores in different cities around the country. You were in Atlanta or other places.
Yeah, we had over 21 stores.
21 stores. And then when Alexander's went out of business, you went into Bloomingdale's, and you went.
Well, that was separate under a different name.
Northern Lights.
Yeah, we wanted to distinguish the Fred the Furrier from, because of the stigma of Alexander's being a medium price store.
So how does Fred the Furrier, who's the entrepreneur, the CEO of the Fur Vault, with his brother Harold over there and his nephew Andrew, with the Andrew Mark situation, decide that he wants to go into politics at the age of about 57. How did you decide to do that?
Well, it was a continuum. I was always
from public service that you wanted in foreign service.
And I always did many things. I was involved with many social service organizations all the way through. And I was chairman of a number of different aspects of the fundraising in New York, and political fundraising and organizational activities. So it was a logical sequence for me. It was always something I was interested in. I thought that I really did a lot at that point. We were a public company. We were well established. We had good management, and I thought that it was time for me to really try something new.
So after that, when you realized that politics wasn't there, you really did a wonderful thing. And let's talk about the Auschwitz Center.
Well, I was running a scholarship program called the Raoul Wallenberg Scholars for the study of leadership and comparative democracies between Hebrew University in Israel and American college graduates. And we took 10 people based upon pure qualifications, not on religious or racial characteristics, but merely on their abilities. And we brought them to Israel for 11 months, and where they interacted with Israelis, and they studied various aspects of developing leadership, what characteristics are required to really be successful leaders.
Right, but then how did you get to Auschwitz?
Well, on one of my trips I met a woman who had come from this is after the breakdown of communism in 1991, and she said that she came from Poland and visited. I asked her where she lived. She said, I lived in Auschwitz. I said, nobody lives in Auschwitz. Yes, it was a town. And she said, you seem so interested. Why don't you go there and take a look at it? You're always going back and forth to Israel because I was on the executive committee of the Board of Governors of the Hebrew University, so I was required to be there 5 times a year. So I did make an arrangement to go to Auschwitz, and I was very taken by the experience of being there and seeing particularly in Birkenau, which is 2 parts of Auschwitz. One was a slave camp, the other one was a murder camp. And the anonymity of the deaths of over 1 million people died in one place. That's unique in history. And I thought that, how can you give these people some representation? How will the world know who these ashes really are? And then I went across to the town. I found out uniquely that this town had a 70% Jewish population, which is very rare for a small town. And I thought if you could just juxtapose the anonymity of the deaths with the very specific lives, people would begin to understand both who died there and how they lived. And they were very people that we can all relate to. There was a tennis player, and there was a dentist, and there was somebody who was in politics, and somebody who was very religious, and somebody who had a bakery. All the kind of.
And how do you decide to the synagogue?
I didn't. I went back and forth looking for a place in the town. I got very close with the mayor, and they were trying to be helpful, but they couldn't find anything for us, and they were desperate to get some economic investment into the town. So finally, when we were about to really leave, it was the 11th hour, the mayor called me and said, you ought to come one more time. This is a period over many years. And came there, and he said, we have a synagogue. And I was shocked, and he brought us over to it. It was a carpet store under the communists, when we saw it. And before that, a German officer had saved it because it had thick walls, and it was used for munition storage during the war. So it survived the war. It didn't look anything like a synagogue after all the changes, but it was an authentic synagogue. So we formed the foundation, and the Polish Parliament passed a law on our behalf for the first communal transfer of communal property to us. And then Ronald Lauder gave us some money to buy a building immediately next to it. So we had a real center with the two buildings put together, and we restored it quite authentically to what a pre-war.
With 2 minutes, I want to make sure that I talk about genocide and talk about the family. Quickly on genocide.
Well, we looked at Auschwitz as an experience. The experience of Auschwitz is, as I said before, is, the greatest horror of a single murder of human beings ever took place in the world. And here, I said, well, what do we learn from that? Who did that? And we found out by thinking about it, it was the highest level of culture that any nation had ever achieved up until that point. So we realized very quickly that education and culture are not bulwarks against barbarity. And the horrors that could be committed by people who had doctorates and who were, leaders in culture and other parts of society. So that's the nature of human life, that genocide is a pervasive illness of human life. And it occurs since the dawn of history to this day. It occurs on all continents, in almost all types of people. Hard to predict, but the result is always the same. Barbarous actions against innocent people.
So the Genocide Center was a program?
So we established that, and we now bring, we've been doing it now for 5 years, and we bring about 25 people at a time for a very intense week-long seminar at Auschwitz, where we have experts come in and talk about the various ways of identifying the early stages preceding a possible genocide, and how to develop tactics to counter all of these things, such as legal interventions, military interventions, economic sanctions, and things of that nature. And we try to get people who are mid-level in their own governments, both in their foreign ministries and in their culture and in their legal ministries, to be able to learn how to prevent that and become future leaders in their countries who are knowledgeable about preventing genocide.
So you said to me you met your wife many, many years ago? You were in the 4th and 5th grade?
Yeah.
So your wife's name is?
Helene.
Okay. And you have how many children?
We have 4.
And the names of the children and the names of the grandchildren?
Well, the names of the children are easy because we use the mnemonic saga, S-A-G-A, Stephen, Amy, Gary, and Annie. Of course, Annie always says that without me, the whole
that's
thing
why
is
your saga is your email. And the grandkids?
The grandkids, we have 7. A new one just came 6 months ago.
It's interesting for the kid from the Bronx whose parents lived in in a railway car up, as you would say, in the Bronx, and for a City College graduate, Fred Schwartz has truly become an interesting person from the fur business, and especially the last 22 years specifically in an exceptional amount of charitable endeavors. And thanks for being here today.
It's really a pleasure to be with you.